Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Putri Sari. My ID number is 20110106017. Now I will explain about translations, problems, and solutions. So there are 9 translations, problems, and solutions. And the first one is title. So literal translations of titles will often fail to grab the prospective audience for the books, and sometimes a complete change is required to make the book sellable. The editors and translators must be prepared to be creative, because some titles lend themselves neatly to English translations, but others don't, and the misleading and off-putting titles can badly damage the potential sales of the books. And then the second is stylized language. Translating a book written in a particular style, even when written by contemporary authors, poses its own problems. Translators are often required to source and examine the original materials and critics in both languages in order to establish the correct mood, tone, and style. Another stylistic problem is that it can be presented by purposeful awkwardness in the original that simply doesn't work in a new language. The important thing is that the translation shouldn't call attention to itself in a way that will mar the reader's experience of the book. And then the third is regional dialect. There are fine lines between making foreign authors accessible to some language readers and making them sound like the language writers. The rhythms and patterns of their own language are part of what makes them interesting, and it can be a mistake to iron them out completely. Sometimes the idioms need little explanations for readers, while leaving in too many unknown cultural references will weaken a book and lose readers. There must be an essence of something difficult. Some languages need lengthy explanations, which can be cumbersome and force the translation to rely on glossaries and notes in order to provide the necessary explanations. And the third, and then the next is strong language. So expletives in the book should always remain. The difficulty lies in making the language accessible and relevant without offending more delicate sensibilities. In some cultures, swearing is an everyday activity, whereas in many other countries, bad language is considered to be less acceptable. Another problem is the worth of expletives in other languages that cannot be matched by other language equivalents. Often, translators will clean up all the strong language in the original without even realizing it, because they don't feel comfortable with it, even though the original writer was. And the translators tend to realize it when only after an editor has pointed out. And then colloquialism. The most important issue with slang is timelines. With some translations, you can almost identify the year or month in which it must have been translated. It can be a question of getting exactly the right translator for the job, or help to employ a second translator, which with a good working knowledge of colloquialisms, dialect, and slang in the native country, who can get across their meaning and help to come up with English equivalents that are appropriate. And then humor. So something hugely funny in another language can fall flat in English without lengthy explanation that certainly reduce any humor involved. The most successful translations of jokes are more likely to be replacements rather than the literal translations. And an equivalence has to be found in the new language, and sometimes this simply don't work, or a completely different play on words has to be invented to retain the liveliness of play. In such cases, the translator and editor might have to decide which is more important to the passage, the literal sense of the phrase or the playfulness that it brings to bear. A fresh pair of eyes can be particularly helpful when it comes to translating a humor. And then untranslatable culture-specific references. So some words simply don't translate. Rose Quartz usually prefers to leave this in text and to provide the reader with a glossary which can serve the purpose of explaining more cultural references without interrupting the flow of the text with lengthy descriptions and explanations. In the end, footnotes may be the only option, that they are certainly a better alternative to lengthy discourse, interrupting the flow of the text. And the next is quotations from other sources. So in the most cases, it is good practice to seek out the existing English translations of quotes or material such as poetry or song lyrics rather than retranslating, not only because of the time constraints involved in creating associations and rhythm between the words of yet another author, but because it is in essence a different art. The demands of finding the equivalent vocabulary that is as rich with allusions and meaning, along with recreating rhythm and rhyme, can pose an insurmountable problem. Some quotes simply don't translate and are the best dropped. Others must be altered to make their meaning and relevance to the text clear. In these cases, a translator must be given some reasons to make appropriate changes. A direct replacement might also be necessary in the case of lyrics, and a note should be made of any other sources from which translations are taken and given to the copy editor along with the translator's note. In some cases, permissions may be required to reproduce someone else's translations. And then the last is difficult language. So there are some language for which high quality translators are few and far between, forcing publishers either to abandon the idea of translating or to rely on the giant efforts of first styling and a native speaker to get the balance right. It may also be necessary to translate from a separate language altogether, because a good native translator can't be found. Thus, to publish an excellent translation in English is to open up possibilities of further translations of that little into other languages throughout the world. Translators whose work will be reused in this way should be paid a fee for that reuse and given the proper acknowledgement or credit in the new translations. Also, permissions will need to be cleared with the rights holder of both of both the English language translations and the original word. So that's all from me, the explanation from me. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.